Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in AQA A-level politics. We're continuing talking about democracy and participation in this lesson, focusing over the next 3 or 4 lessons on the idea of the history of democratic participation. This lesson specifically is going to look at how suffrage has changed since the Great Reform Act of 1832 to the present day. Now, fundamentally, there are lots of different ways in which suffrage has changed since the Great Reform Act to the present day. I'm going to go into as much detail as possible, looking at as many of these pieces of legislation as possible, but just note that I've not looked at every single piece of legislation, okay? You would probably not be expected to know every single law that has taken place since the Great Reform Act of 1832 all the way to the present day that has changed the nature of suffrage in the UK's political system. But you should know the main ones, okay? You should know the main ones. You should have a good idea of the main ones, all right? So let's talk about this. We'll talk about the Great Reform Act of 1832. We'll talk about what the Great Reform Act essentially did and the ways in which suffrage actually looked in 1832. Suffrage, of course, being the ability for people to vote. The aim, of course, the ultimate aim, is to achieve what we would describe as universal suffrage. Suffrage such that everybody, within reasonable limits, of course, is able to vote. So universal suffrage obviously doesn't include anybody under the age of 18, although there are debates about whether or not this should be lowered to 16. But people who are above a certain age should all be allowed to vote. It's theoretically the concept of universal suffrage. And so we have to look at where it was in 1832 and how close we have gotten to the present day to this goal of universal suffrage. So let's begin first then. The Great Reform Act of 1832. This was the major step that we see towards democratisation in the United Kingdom, or in Great Britain, okay? It abolished many what were known as, quote, rotten boroughs. These were parliamentary constituencies that had very few voters. And what it did instead was redistribute seats to more populated urban areas, more populated urban environments. So where there were seats that had very few voters, owing to the fact that there wasn't universal suffrage, of course, they took those seats away and they redistributed them to more populated areas. Theoretically, therefore, under that conceptualization, it means that they actually allow for more democratic participation. They allow for more people to be represented in the sense that the rotten boroughs, quote unquote, are no longer getting representation, whereas the more populated areas are. Of course, this is a very roundabout way of saying that that this increased representation, but only for eligible voters, which was still very limited. The franchise that existed, the franchise referring to the people who are able to vote, the number of people and the groups of people who are able to vote, who are eligible to vote. The franchise itself was made up of men who owned property worth at least £10, which, at least prior to the Great Reform Act, this significantly increased the number of voters, but still included the majority of working class, and it excluded, should I say, all women from voting. So this is quite interesting. So even though this is a very limited starting point that we're beginning with the Great Reform Act, it was still a major step forward in terms of what came prior to the Great Reform Act. So the franchise that begins in 1832 with the Great Reform Act is that of all men who owned property worth £10. But that obviously excluded any man who was working class pretty much, who didn't have any property worth £10, and it excluded all women. The next major piece of legislation that we see is the 1867 Second Reform Act. What this act did was expand the electorate to include urban working men who met certain property qualifications. And what the result was a near doubling of the number of voters who were eligible to vote in elections. This marked a shift towards a broader electorate, although maintaining this, it is still the case that all women were disenfranchised, they were unable to vote, so too were many working class men. because the key thing that limited working class men from voting was the fact that there were property qualifications. Now, if you vote in a general election, you don't have to own property at all. There is no necessary requirement to own any kind of property in order to vote in general elections in the United Kingdom. But back then, there were still property qualifications. And of course, there is still the disenfranchisement of all women from voting. Next, we see a series of pieces of legislation that takes place from 1884 to 1918. In fact, a lot of the next few pieces of legislation were all called Representation of the People Act. So there's quite a few different Representation of the People Acts. The pieces of legislation from 1884 to 1918 were some of the most significant pieces of legislation which truly expanded the franchise quite significantly. Between 1884 and 1918, however, there were two specific pieces of legislation. One, of course, being passed in the early 1880s. The second being passed towards the end of the First World War. The 1884 Representation of the People Act extended the same voting qualifications that existed in the previous Second Reform Act to that of the countryside voters, as existed in boroughs, enfranchising many rural working class men. It tripled the electorate, but still excluded a number of working class men and still excluded all women. After the end of the First World War, however, the Representation of the People Act from 1918 was probably the most landmark piece of legislation in UK suffrage history, because what this did was granted the vote to all men over the age of 21, removing pretty much all property requirements and property qualification requirements. So any man who was over the age of 21 was eligible to vote. In addition to this, for the first time, it allowed women to vote. Women over 30 who met a minimum property qualification were were graduates, could also be able to vote. So for the first time, women were able to vote, but they were subjected to the same property qualifications that men had been subjected to prior to this legislation. So now all men over 21 could now vote, which included all working class men as well, but there were still now women who had to have minimum property qualifications or graduation qualifications in order to vote. But the result from this was absolutely groundbreaking. It expanded the electorate, it expanded the number of people who could vote in Great Britain from 7.7 million people prior to 1918 to 21.4 million now after the passage of this legislation. 10 years later, we see the next Representation of the People Act, this time being in 1928. This act granted equal voting rights to men and women, allowing all adults over the age of 21 to vote regardless of property ownership. So the property requirements for women or the graduation requirements for women had disappeared. This established what we would describe as universal suffrage in the United Kingdom. In fact, what this did was double the female electorate. But the United Kingdom didn't stop there. In 1948, we see the next Representation of the People Act. This act abolished a system known as plural voting. This is where some individuals could vote in more than one constituency due to the fact that they had either property ownership in various constituencies or through university representation. This idea of plural voting was abolished, which meant that you had one vote per person. Obviously, the reason for this was because if you were somebody who had plural voting, the ability to do plural voting, it meant that you were often an upper-class, wealthy individual who was more likely than not a man because you had property in other constituencies or you had university representation. And so as a result of which, it meant that men who were upper-class had greater representation in elections than everybody else. The abolition of this plural voting meant that you could vote in one constituency. It also redrew the constituency boundaries, which would then better reflect population changes. In 1969, we see the 1969 Representation of the People Act. This act lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, acknowledging the maturity and contribution of younger adults in society, a number that has stayed the same ever since, and maintains and is maintainingly the number that you have to be, the age that you have to be in order to be able to vote in the UK today. It also expanded the electorate to include younger demographics, further democratizing the political process.